Okay, so rather than going over that example from class, let me just try to go over the different types of variables that you should know. Okay? And different terms. You should know independent variable, dependent variable. You should know also what levels are. You should know what confound is, and you should know what a control variable is as well. Right, so you should definitely know all of these terms to answer the questions. Now, I don't want you to get the idea that the whole test is going to be on this. If you know all of this, you'll pass the test. Let me put it this way. You need to know these terms to understand the questions, right? So don't stop here, but make sure you understand these concepts. So one thing I use as an example in class was this study. May not be exactly like this, but it'll work for this example. And so we have an IV called time of day, an IV called caffeine. And for caffeine, you should be able to read a question and understand what the levels are of that variable. You should be able to read the question and know what are the independent variables, what are the dependent variables, and generally just understand the design of a study, right? So practice that definitely. I like to design this, right? To take that example, put it into this format to help me visualize and understand the question. You don't necessarily, well, you won't be asked to do this for the exam, but this is something I do to help me understand, right? So, okay, for caffeine, you read the question. It says you had people who had a regular cup of coffee and some people who had decaf. Great. Then you had time of day, and for that, let's say you had morning and you had afternoon. Now to see, okay, one term I'm missing there is manipulated variable and measured. See, we have all these terms. I know it's confusing, but hopefully this helps a little bit. So we have manipulated and measured variables. Well, one thing I can already start to think about is, well, did they have a manipulated variable in this study, right? I'm asking specifically about, let me look for the pointer, here it is, about this here. Is there a manipulated variable? Well, I can't really tell just from this. You wouldn't be able to tell just from what I've drawn here. You really have to read the question. You have to read the question and see, did the researcher put some people here and then some people here, right? Did they have control of the independent variables? So definitely when we're talking about manipulated variables, you're thinking independent variables. Did the researcher not only have control, did they vary the experience of participants? Now keep in mind that although it's here for my IVs, I have two levels, regular cup of coffee, decaf, and then for time of day, morning and afternoon, that's only that way because as a researcher, I designed it that way, or whoever designed the study. There could be different levels. There could be 1 cup of coffee, 2 cups of coffee, 3 cups of coffee, and then decaf, or for time of day. It could be morning, afternoon, and night. But pay careful attention to, I'm trying to erase that. Pay careful attention to the description that I give you in the examples. Make sure that to you, pay careful attention to the examples I give you. That's what I'm trying to say. Don't try to bring in your own meaning. Don't overthink it. Just read exactly what I have. If I say regular cup of coffee and decaf, don't get into anything else. Don't get into other versions of the study that you're thinking of on your own. So for example, for manipulated variable, you might get lost and stuck on thinking, well, the lighting in the room, they can manipulate that. The temperature, they can manipulate that. You're not focusing on that. You're just focusing on the independent variables, and you're looking at, well, did the researcher vary the experience for the research participants on that independent variable, caffeine, time of day, or whatever their IVs are? Or did they just measure? So for example, for caffeine, did the researcher assign people to drink a regular cup of coffee or decaf? Or did they recruit people who drank coffee and compared them to people who don't drink coffee? If they're recruiting people who already drink coffee, they're not manipulating, they're not assigning people to drink coffee, they're just recruiting people who already drink coffee. So I don't have a manipulation in that last example. But let's go back to this example. Okay, so in this example, I tell you, yes, they assigned participants to either a regular cup, get the marker, a regular cup of coffee in the morning, or a regular cup of coffee in the afternoon, or decaf in the morning, or decaf in the afternoon. Okay, so pay attention to that part. And then in terms of the measured variable, well, think about, well, were any of these variables measured? So from the information I've given you, you can tell whether it was manipulated or not, but I haven't given you in this video any information on what was measured yet. In the examples I give you in the exam, I will, but keep that in mind. You're thinking about, well, was there something that just was measured? That you asked the participants to either self-report, or you observed them, or you measured their performance on any variable in some way. So in this case, let's say the DV is attention level. And then let's say I measured attention level by looking at people's eyes. So that's supposed to be an eye. And seeing how much of the time were their eyes fully open. You might not agree with that definition of how I measured it, right? My operationalization. But that's fine. You don't have to agree. But that's how I measured it. Well, I'm not forcing people to open and close their eyes. I'm not choosing whether they get to open their eyes or not, right? I'm just looking at how often is their eye open, how often is it closed. I'm just measuring it. So this DV is measured, and most of the times we're going to find that variables that are the DV are the measured variable. So keep that in mind. Now, okay, now we've covered manipulated, we've covered measured. Now, let's go to independent. We've been discussing this, but the independent variable is a variable we think is causing the DV. So here, we think caffeine is causing attention, and we think time of day is causing attention, right? These are both IVs. Here's our DV. We're considering two IVs, and that's fine. But in both situations, we're thinking that consumption of caffeine is somehow going to influence attention, and time of day that we have people take the test is going to influence attention. Sometimes you can figure out which one is the IV and the DV just by logically thinking about, is it possible for it to be the other way around? So for example, can you consider a situation where attention would change coffee intake? And I'm not saying, well, people who are less able to pay attention drink less or more caffeine. I'm saying, can you think of a situation where, because I'm falling asleep, suddenly I jump into the other category of decaf coffee? No, that's still kind of a fuzzy example, but how about this one? Does my attention level somehow change the time of day? Imagine the participants in the room, they're paying less attention. Because they're paying less attention, the time of day changes around them. No, that doesn't happen, right? So sometimes you can logically think through it and see, well, which one's the IV and DV? Is it even possible for you to have the flip? But mostly I would say read the example carefully. See what they think is causing what. Does caffeine influence attention? Okay, so it's getting crowded here, but does caffeine influence attention? If you have a statement like that, well, identify the variables and see, is it clear which direction I'm thinking things to go in? The influencer is the IV. What is being influenced is a DV. Okay? So now we have dependent variable, dependent variable. Okay, so now we're going to get into levels. That's a little tricky. And I'm actually going to add conditions. Conditions. There you go. Okay, so let's see if I can clean this up a bit. So let's see if I can find a cutting tool. Yes, perfect. Okay, so moving this over here. Now I'm gonna make this bigger. Okay, so remember, we're focusing on levels and conditions. Levels, conditions. Again, remember, this is important for you to conceptually understand. This is not exactly what's going to be on the exam. You need to understand this for this class. So this will be helpful for you later on as well. So keep this video in mind. Okay, so, levels. When we're thinking about levels, we're specifically thinking about just each IV one at a time. Okay, remember, levels, one IV, one at a time. Okay, so let's go with caffeine. We're doing caffeine first. And when determining the levels, we just have to think about, well, what experiences of caffeine can a participant experience? In this case, you have a regular cup of coffee, or you have decaf. That's it. So now if I ask you how many levels do you have for caffeine, you know, okay, it's regular cup and decaf. If I ask you how many levels, 1, 2. That's it for levels for caffeine. Now let's do time of day. Time of day. Okay, so now time of day, focusing on that, we're looking here, right? It could be time. It doesn't really matter what you're calling this when you're trying to figure out the levels. But time of day, you ideally you're drawing this out or you're reading the description, the example carefully. But if I said something along the lines of, I had some participants have a regular cup of coffee, some a decaf cup of coffee, and I had some participants go in the morning and some in the afternoon, you should from there, my suggestion would be draw this. So, okay, in this case, participants can experience two situations related to time of day. They can experience the morning or afternoon. You might be thinking, well, why only those times? You could have night. Why not that? Well, because I didn't design it that way. You could have it. If you did that, you could do it that way. You could add night. But you have to read the example carefully. In this example, I'm not giving that as an option for my participants. I'm not assigning them to those conditions. This is a limit. So again, here, if I ask you how many levels of time of day, I have 1, I have 2. Now, these are levels, right? 1, 2 for caffeine, 1, 2 for time of day. Now, conditions. Conditions are the various experiences or situations your participants can experience across your study. It's going to change based on whether you have 1 IV or 2 IVs. I'm going to write this up here to remind me to review that. 1 versus 2. But let's do this example first. Okay, so in this example here, we have this design. When I'm talking about conditions, again, I'm talking about all the experiences. So in this case, we have a regular cup of coffee in the morning. So I could have some participants experience that. and then measure their attention, or decaf cup of coffee in the morning, or regular cup of coffee in the morning, or decaf in the afternoon. There are four conditions. You could also think about it as four combinations resulting from the levels of your IVs, right? Now, let's say, maybe I wanted to do a new study where I wanted to look at night. Well, I'm teaching night courses too. I'm interested in seeing, does the impact of caffeine, does it vary across the day for my classes? I'm going to offer this to my students. I'm going to give it for free, not in real life, but as an example. How might this relate to their attention across the day? So I've added this third level to time of day. Okay, fine, I've done that. Now this changes the level of conditions. Let me show you how. So now you have night here for time of day, right? So let me write this here. Draw this out. Now you have two more conditions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If this was your design, time of day with 3 levels, caffeine with 2 levels, now you have 6 conditions. You don't really need to know how to figure out conditions for this exam, but you do need to know what a condition is. You do need to know what a level is, and just understand those concepts, because these questions are going to require you to know some of that. So the reason why I had this note here is, let me show you something. In this example, let's do this. Maybe I only had time of day. Time of day. Maybe I only had time of day, and I brought in participants in the morning, afternoon, and night. Let's say I brought in participants. I assigned them to come in the morning. Actually, let me separate this a little bit. The morning, afternoon, or night. They didn't do all three, just one of these time slots. Then I compared how much attention they paid in the morning compared to the afternoon compared to at night. Maybe I'm deciding when's the best time to teach this course. This course tends to be very dry and boring, so I want to make sure I choose the best time slot. So that's the situation. But here, okay, again, you have time of day, you have 3 levels, and you don't have a second variable, independent variable in this situation. You just have one IV and one DV. I'll do attention again. And again, you get these details from reading the question, but in this case, I have 1, 2, 3 conditions. So this is only the case when you have one IV, but when you have one IV, the levels and conditions are equal. So let's see. Okay, so I have levels, I have conditions. Now, confound and control variable. Okay, so confound and control variable. This one is actually not as related to all this, but I can work off of this example. Let me copy and paste this example really quickly. Here we go. Again, I'm gonna bring this down here. Okay, so here we're not gonna care too much about this breakdown. Here it's more conceptual. So let's say you were interested in this study, how does caffeine and time of day influence attention? But you were worried that the temperature would influence attention. I don't know. Let me see if I can make a closed eye. Yeah, that looks pretty good for me. So, okay, maybe if it's really hot, right, people get sleepier. And that might influence your findings, right? Because some days it's gonna be hot, some days it's gonna be cool, especially with the weather right now, right? And in LA, sometimes you have really, really hot weather. Depending on the classroom, that might influence. It might get really hot, So what if people are getting sleepy because of the heat and not the time of day and not how much coffee they're drinking? Then that's going to be an issue, right? So what you need to do is you need to control for this confound. So that confound is anything that might influence your what you're observing in terms of the relationship between the IV and the DV. If you're worried that temperature might influence attention, I don't know why I do that, but it's an arrow. If you're worried that it's going to influence attention, then you should try and get that out of your study. Factor that out. How can you factor that out so it doesn't influence attention, right? Because you don't care about temperature. You care about coffee. You care about the time of day. Well, one thing you could do to deal with this confound is, well, okay, fine. Let me hold the temperature at 75 degrees consistently. You turn up, the air conditioning, or you turn up the heater depending on the day, and you hold this temperature across participants. Right? Everybody gets this temperature. And then it doesn't matter where they're at in terms of their condition, they're always getting this temperature. So in this case, I'm writing temperature in that condition. So when you control it, it just means you've held it constant or consistent or the same, right? These are all synonyms, but hold this temperature the same across all participants. All participants experience this temperature. Now, I had a student who brought up, well, what if, could a control variable, right? So once you've controlled it, once you set that temperature the same for everybody, it's a control variable. You've controlled for that confound. You factored out that confound. That's another way to say it. Well, you're good. You don't have to worry about it. But the student asked, can this also be a manipulated variable? Can temperature of the room be something that a researcher might be interested in? Well, you know what? Yeah. So let's say, let's go back to this design here. It looks like it's locked there. Like it's locked the drawings. I can't change that, but so let's say I have these people do 50 degrees and these people do 90 degrees. And look at how is temperature in the room. So I'm not holding it constant anymore. How is temperature in the room going to influence attention? Well, now temperature, instead of being a control variable, is part of my study. I've manipulated it. Some people get 50 degrees, some people get 90 degrees. So this is now a manipulated variable in my study. So mostly any variable can either be a confound or it could be manipulated. Unless you can't manipulate it, like gender, right? You can't assign people to male or female. But there are variables that can be either or. What you have to read carefully is the study description. Look at what it's being described. Look at what's being described. See what details are giving you. If they're telling you the researcher designed it or put some participants in a 50-degree room and others in a 90-degree room, then it's most likely a manipulated variable. If the question instead reads like the researcher was looking at caffeine and time of day and was worried about the impact of temperature, or another researcher brought that up as an issue, then it's most likely a confound variable. If the researcher held it the same for everybody, then that makes it a control variable because they've controlled that confound. Okay? So keep in mind, manipulated, control, different things, know the difference, know that a confound is something that might influence your outcome that you don't want to influence your outcome. Your control variable is when you've controlled for this. Manipulated is you actually want this in your study. You want this. You've designed it into your study and you've varied people's experience of a variable In the study that makes it manipulated, most likely, I can't think of a situation when not, it would be your IV. And that's a long video, but hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully you can just skip to the section that's the most helpful to you. But this is essentially what I want you to understand for this class, not just for exam 1. Keep that in mind. This is important for the entire class to understand what a compound and all these terms mean. Okay, I know that was a lot, but if you have questions, please let me know. Please don't hesitate reaching out to me. Then also feel free to skip around to what's the most useful to you.